Hey everybody, welcome to Pit Stops to Podium, the RevPartners podcast where we talk to execs who have competed and won. My name is Brendan Tollison. I am the co-founder and CEO of RevPartners, and I'm excited to have with me today Sam Ellis, a West Point grad, the technical co-founder of Dutchie, who has reached unicorn status and currently serves as a managing director of WPMC and partner at Scout Ventures. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks, Brendan. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Well, great. It's a joy to have a West Point grad. I am not a West Point grad. However, my partner and co-founder in RevPartners is a West Point grad. So it's fun to have that connection. But Sam, before we kind of get into our typical rhythm, would love to understand a little bit more about who WPMC is, as well as Scout Ventures.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I did a couple 0-to-1 roles back to back. So both at Dutchie and then at Point 72, building out some systematic infrastructure for their large quant book. And for me, I really wanted to do more 0-to-1 at scale. And so kind of like a horizontal scale in particular across several companies, right? So I think the best way to do that is oftentimes being an early stage investor or kind of like incubator, accelerator. I leaned a little bit more towards the early stage investor route, just a little bit faster to get traction. And so I put together a small fund that was focused on investing in software companies, have a fairly heavy affinity group towards founders of West Point grads, mostly as kind of like bolster innovation in that community, and then also building a brand around that immediate first degree network as kind of like, hey, this is a really good person to go talk to and a good touch point for software companies in the early stage. And it, I think for anyone who's doing a first time fund, it's kind of a challenging experience, right? Because it's like, track record is really important for fundraising, and usually it makes sense to start at a relatively small scale. And this very much was the case, right? Where, WPMC is kind of more of a lower volume, higher touch shop as we really figure out how to get the mechanics down of managing a fund, and in particular, like an early stage software fund. So almost all B2B SaaS companies, check sizes between 100 and 750K, and really focused on getting fantastic founders and founder market fit, and indexing pretty heavily on leadership and ability to execute a venture scale company from kind of the early stage forward. So that's kind of the quick of it with WPMC. Also recently joined Scout Ventures as a partner, and will be they're traditionally a dual use and deep tech fund, and they've done some SaaS in the past, had some success there, and looking to expand upon that. So I'm joining Scout as a partner to really focus on the SaaS portfolio and continuing to bolster their deal pipeline and a number of deals and kind of the pre-seed and seed stage, and even some incubations as a and kind of software and SaaS space.
That's great. Well, we'll get back into kind of that core competency as our big idea, because I think you have an amazing experience within that category. But before we do that, we have a tradition here at Pit Stops Podium where we get to know you a little bit. So you're a busy guy, but what are 3 fun facts that our community should know about you, Sam, outside of work?
Sure thing. Yeah, I think the first and probably most central to life outside of work is really, really into endurance sports. So triathlon, looks like Ironman triathlon, and then ultra running. So, recently did a 24-hour race and have 2 full Ironmans coming up, and then 2 half Ironmans coming up, and 100 mile at the end of the year. So that consumes a lot of my time and bandwidth outside of work. And I think it's, very functional. It's a very functional hobby, right? Or you're working on fitness and the mental fitness as well. So that probably takes like the majority of time. And then I also probably another sort of fun fact, people who are fairly close to me know this one, is there's so many forms of expressive writing, but I really like lyrics and hip hop, and enjoy writing and occasionally recording and just kind of messing around with that as I don't know, just like a form of the creative expression. And I'd say the last fun fact is that I'm just really obsessed with personal growth and growing as a person, to the point where I'll go outside if I know it's going to rain, I'd rather choose to run in the rain so I can get a little bit better, right? Just mentally, because it's harder and more of a barrier to overcome. So any of those barriers, I welcome them, and which I know is a touch insane and touch intense, but I think for a large part of life is about self-transcendence, and that's kind of my way of constantly chasing it. It's like hunting harder stuff that's hopefully functional and productive.
feel like that's a common theme with the West Point people that I've met. So
yeah, probably. You're probably right.
Yeah. So anybody that ever complains about not having time, just remember this interview with Sam Ellis and what he does with his time. There are no more excuses. Well, let's transition to the big idea, Sam. And so, the big theme of our podcast is all about transitioning from high growth to high scale. However, I think what you have expertise in is really interesting, and especially for our audience. And that's really around that traction concept that you mentioned, where you go from that 0 to 1. So how do you go from 0 to growth? And so you had mentioned a few experiences. How about you dive into that a little bit further, and then let's jump into 3 big themes that you've been able to capture as a result of the experience that you've had.
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's tons and tons and tons of common mistakes that entrepreneurs make in that kind of like 0 to 1 path. I think this is where like most companies either die or incur fatal wounds that cause them to die later on. Right. And it's like a lot of it is, I like to lean on this maxim of like, all companies have the ability to be successful if they can pivot infinitely quickly. Right. So like, I think if you like keep in mind, because like the early stages of building a company, they're perilous, are like basically understanding value market fit and product market fit. And like, I think that'd be a good thing to jump into it in a second. But at its core principle, it's like understanding currently where you are, where your customer sees value, where their problem is, and then being able to like close that gap, right? And if you can close that gap infinitely quickly, then you'll find success, right? But like it oftentimes is challenging for companies to be able to like iterate quickly enough on the product and be able to learn quickly enough, and in order to like cover that gap and actually find clean product market fit and get traction and be set up to do more of like the RevOps and growth stuff. So
right.
Yeah, that's kind of the quick snippet of it.
That's great. Yeah, let's dive down a little bit further and let's use some anchors for that. So let's first talk a little bit about the perspective of both the entrepreneur and investor. I mean, you've sat in both seats, so would love to get your insight on that lens on both sides.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I think as an entrepreneur, it's fun, especially for me on the technical side, and I help support a lot of the fundraising and support a lot of filling out like the early stage data rooms and supporting early stage stats, and so I think as an entrepreneur, you're almost always concerned about like the next fire, right? Or it feels like in an early stage where you're just like, all right, well, and it's oftentimes you forget about like the meta strategy and what's like really centrally important. And I think the really smart entrepreneurs are able to stay acutely focused on their KPIs and the right KPIs, right? And are constantly able to like adjust and reflect that. But it's very easy to get in the trap of like, whoa, I have like 60 things to do on my to-do list. I just need to start blasting them, right? And it's like, it's easy to be kind of heads down and forget about the actual mechanics of the business that really matter. And so I think and it's also so easy to get like trapped in a vision, right? Like trapped and locked into like, all right, well, we had this initial vision as founders and we're setting out, and like, there's almost a subconscious blindness that occurs because you have this like vision, you're just like, you just show up and like want to execute, right? And like really good entrepreneurs are like doers. They always take the next step. So it's like, I think you, and probably second time founders have this like 30,000 foot view a lot better. And, I think a good paradigm to lean into is kind of like when in doubt, just like zoom out, right? So if you're ever like not sure like what tasks you're doing, then, or those are like chief importance, then it's important to like keep that retrospective reference of like, okay, what have I done? What hasn't worked? And like, what do I need to be doing going forward? And I think as an investor, it's a lot easy to just like look at the company as like a unit, right? And be like, okay, well, I know there's a variety of inputs that a company needs to be successful. And you almost don't see, it's like challenging to see like that lens of the entrepreneur where they're just like, all right, dude, I'm just showing up and executing. Right. And so it's like, so you're more concerned about probably principally the team, right? And like that's at least early stage, and that's like a super central element. But when you're looking at the like actual mechanics of the company, like I think for the investors in the most part, and I think it took me a while to really figure this out as an entrepreneur, but like you're effectively looking at the company's ability to safely take on risk, right? Which is like capital that you're putting in the company, right? So, and I think a lot of like modern entrepreneurs miss like when should I actually raise capital, right? And this is like a really important point, I think, is like, all right, well, you should raise capital when you can take on risk, and you can take on risk when you have either a clear path or a proven path to to like generating a constructive CAC to LTV, right? Where you're like, okay, we built some product or service, and we know that like we have our customer segment that wants to receive this, right, and are willing to pay some amount for it. We just need to figure out like, okay, how do we systematically and efficiently acquire the customers, and then being able to like have a favorable ratio to like how like the lifetime value, right? So it's like, I mean, that's like I think the central figure of like, what makes a company work, right? It's like, can you like scalably and systematically acquire customers and have that favorable ratio, right? And so it's like, and obviously it's much deeper than that, right? But like, I think at kind of like a core principle, that's a really good thing to stay focused on. And like as an investor, it's much easier than because you're looking at this kind of like high level view. Whereas like as an entrepreneur, you're like, you're not constantly obsessed with that kind of like central paradigm, right? So I think those are probably there's probably several of those differences, but it's probably one of the biggest ones I see.
Yeah, I like how you kind of outline the different perspective, depending on where you're sitting on that side of the equation, either the entrepreneur and the investor. And I think a natural segue even into that is thinking about the value fit versus product market fit that you were just describing. So, walk us through kind of how you view those two things in light of what you've already described.
Yeah, for sure. So I think like product market fit, I think that's kind of like the range where you can like really confidently take on risk, right? I think in like value market fit, you can like take on risk like somewhat comfortably, but like not with pure confidence yet, right? So and to draw the distinction between those, I think value market fit, in my eyes, this can and should occur before you even start like substantial engineering efforts, right? It's like, I think this is probably one of the highest like casualties for companies is like overspending and over delivering on product they don't quite understand like where it fits yet. And just because they're like, all right, well, I'm excited, like I have this vision, like let's start building stuff, right? Like that's like the general MO for like I think most early stage entrepreneurs, because it's like, yeah, I mean, like you're excited, you're back probably against the wall to some extent, you want to start building stuff, like yeah, I get it, let's go. But like achieving value market fit first, which is this like notion of like having an intimate understanding of what your customer's problem is and like the solution that they want to see, but before you even have a product, right? Or like, I mean, I think most simply it could be like an InVision or Figma prototype, right? Where you're working with a designer and like, okay, well, here's like the prototype that we have, and we suspect that this fixes the problem, but like, does this actually fix the problem for you, right? Like, can you like see and feel this? Does this make sense? And like, is there a reasonable amount of excitement over it that it does fix your problem? Of value market fit is being able to feel that like excitement and expressiveness from your prospective customers, right? Where it's like, yeah, when does this come? Like, when do you go from prototype to like a real thing that I can use, right? And so there's really no reason to start building until you have a reasonable degree of confidence around that point, right? And I think that for a little bit more experience or entrepreneurs with like a better vision, then once you kind of achieve that like value market fit, then I think that's kind of a checkpoint where you can potentially take on capital and be able to build out. But I mean, like, I think the safest point to be able to take on risk is like post like product market fit, right? Where like you actually have built the thing, people are using it, and you're not constantly getting like people screaming at you because there's stuff missing or broken, right? That's kind of like it's a tremendous amount of work and iteration and like just honestly like stamina and persistence to get there. But I think people really underestimate how important it is to first get value market fit before product market fit and be able to like actually save on all the resources that would have gone into building product when like you're not even entirely positive that like that the kids want it yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I like that. Don't skip steps, and it's the value market fit informs the product market fit, which I like a lot. And so let's transition to the last point, because I think it plays well into that, is some of these major decisions that have to be made along that kind of road from value market fit to product market fit to ultimately raising that money that you were describing. So two decisions that I'd love to kind of hear your input on. One is thinking about people, and the second is just thinking about the go-to-market strategy. So I know it's a big ask for those two specific decisions, but I think it'd be interesting to think in light of that progression, how do you make those decisions around people and strategy?
Right. Yeah. So I think like early day org charts are really, really tricky to like nail down. And I think the way that people can start to think of it is like, what are our next like few constraints, right? Like what are our next few major constraints? And like, that's kind of how you should be thinking about hiring and being able to like early stage, you have to have people that are like owners, right? They're almost like mini entrepreneurs, and that there's like a high level of independence and like kind of like pressure on you, right? Like you're almost guaranteed to be under resourced, and you're like in a challenging spot in terms of like, all right, well, we need to deliver a lot. And so, you can kind of, I think through hopefully the next like couple of constraints, and that's kind of like what informs the early day org chart. And it's probably more individual contributor heavy than like manager heavy, right? Like it's very, you don't need like a VP of anything too early, right? Like you need people like in the trenches digging. It's just that simple, right? And so like oftentimes if your constraint is engineering, and then like your constraint is really engineering, and like, okay, well your next two hires are probably engineers, right? But if like your constraint is, you're like, okay, well once we have that constraint satisfied, we're still kind of slow on sales after that, right? So you can train sales, and you need to like have that really, really strong anchor, like account executive, really strong anchor, even like an early couple SDRs could be helpful. And so I think that's helpful. And then there's always like from the engineering perspective, a question I feel like I often end up like discussing with people is like, do we do early engineers, or do we do like contractors, or overseas contractors or not? And I always think that is kind of a tricky one. I'd always lean more towards having like an awesome organic in-house team over anything, but there are times I think when contractors make sense. And that's like, I think if you have a point of continuity and someone with high technical acumen who can manage the contractors, like pick the stack, help direct things properly, then I think it can make sense before you like have capital to bring on like a really, really competent core engineering team. But it's really important to have that point of continuity where someone can like, all right, well, we know we're going to use this stack because it's going to make hiring easier. We're going to use this stack because like I'm familiar with it, you can scale it, and know kind of like some of the pitfalls. And then I also think like one of the people really quickly on kind of the contractor V in-house FTE, like if you're someone with really strong leadership acumen and like you're good at building culture, then like it'll probably almost always make sense to go in-house FTE, right? So I think it's like, I don't know, but there's, a variety of times where contractors make sense, especially if you need like bridge an experience gap or like move quickly, frankly, right? We're like, okay, well, stuff to do really fast. I don't have time to like hire the perfect person. Cause like hiring a perfect person is a lot more important than hiring fast, I think, right? So I think that's the quick snapshot on kind of like thinking about personnel. And moving on to the other point, like figuring out early go to market. I think this is like so different across e-com companies, D2C companies, even like consumer SaaS versus like B2B SaaS companies. I think for the most part, though, I think there are probably like a couple like, probably there's like the large scale consumer marketing side, and then like B2B more enterprise SMB sales side, right? And I think companies that excite me most in that latter category, because it's like the category I'm more familiar with and look at more often, is like, I'll typically write in the notes and assess a company by like, does this person have like a sales ringer, right? Like someone who truly understands the product and how to sell it, right? And like and understands actually like, hey, here are like HubSpot best practices, and here are how we maintain touch points, and here are how we like do content marketing. There's if you don't have that person, then I think it's like it's stressful for me for a company. Like I wouldn't want to invest in a company that doesn't understand and have that really sound like go-to-market capability. So if you're a sales leader, if you're looking at enterprise and SMB stuff, right? I think on the consumer side, there's so much, I think, tribal knowledge around understanding the variety of channels, or like ad channels, email channels, or like just like more general organic and social content. You have to understand like someone who can build a really good funnel, understands the different stages of the funnel, how to like focus. So I think it mostly comes down to like GTM, honestly comes down to like personnel decision again, right? Which is like kind of funny that that's our last topic, but it's like there's no, for me as like as an engineer, or even like looking at someone like Ross, the co-founder and CEO of Dutchie, who's like amazing, natural, talented salesperson, like, you have your core competency, and like, it doesn't make sense to stray outside your competitive advantage too much. So it's like, yeah, like think through your next constraint, especially if that GTM is one of them, and like, make sure that you're covered down on a key hire or like key resource, right? So it's just so hard to know, right? It's so hard to like learn all of the intricacies of like HubSpot or Salesforce, and learn like even like the etiquette for setting up calls and touch points and battle rhythms. Like it's like a tremendous amount of stuff to know, to have like core GTM competencies down well. But I think you hopefully know enough to be deadly and know enough to recognize the right people, right? That's probably the most important part.
Right. Well, yeah, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I think to your point, that 0 to 1 and getting that traction is not easy. That's why very few kind of get past that point and ultimately look to be funded because what you just outlined is a hard road. And so when you think about, if we kind of summarize that whole concept of looking through the lens of the investor versus the entrepreneur, looking at kind of the fit, value market fit versus product market fit, and ultimately the decisions around go to market and people, you have to get a lot of things right in order for all that to work and ultimately execute. And so thank you for sharing your wisdom in this specific topic. Sam, if people want to learn more about you and or more about the companies that you serve, what would be some practical next steps they could take?
Probably just following on LinkedIn is probably the easiest. Or you can check out WPMC.fund or scoutventures.com to kind of check out portfolios and rest about the team and kind of like the thesis and mission and all of that. That's the quick of it.
Great. Or if you're running in the rain next time and you see Sam, you can try to stay with him for the next 6 hours if you have that type of endurance.
That's it. I'm out there. Yeah, if it's a nasty day, I'm out there grinding for sure.
All right, Sam. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.
Of course. Take care, Brennan. Thanks.